At 6:47 in the morning on March 6, 2025, inside a secure briefing room on the fourth floor of the Langevin block in Ottawa, a man who had just been handed the most powerful job in Canada read a 2-page intelligence summary, set it face down on the table, and said 4 words to the room: "Good, now we begin." That man was Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England, the only person in modern history to run 2 G7 central banks, and what he had just read was a full account of Donald Trump's latest tariff ultimatum against the country Carney had just been sworn in to lead. What happened in the 48 hours that followed has never been fully reported, but tonight, based on accounts from multiple people briefed on the situation and documents reviewed by this channel, we are going to walk you through it, because what Carney did next didn't just answer Trump. It quietly began dismantling the trade architecture that has protected American industry for 30 years, and the consequences are now landing on American consumers, American farmers, and American retirees with a speed that Washington did not anticipate and cannot yet explain. If you have been watching this channel, you already know that we follow these stories before they become mainstream headlines. If you are new here, subscribe right now and hit the bell, because this story is moving fast, and the next development could come within hours. What we are about to walk through together is not speculation. It is a sequence of documented decisions, confirmed meetings, and market movements that tell a story Washington does not want told in plain language. Stay with us for the full picture, because the most important part, the part that directly affects your retirement, your grocery bill, and the value of every American-made product you buy, is still coming. To understand why Carney's response was so devastating, you have to understand who Mark Carney actually is, and you have to understand what Trump thought he was dealing with. According to 3 sources familiar with the internal White House trade discussions, the Trump team entered the Canada confrontation with a clear strategic assumption: Canada would blink. They had blinked before. Under Justin Trudeau, who had led Canada through Trump's first-term tariff battles, Ottawa's response had been retaliatory in the short term, but ultimately conciliatory. Canadian officials had travelled to Washington, held quiet meetings, and eventually found accommodating language that gave Trump something to announce as a win. The Trump trade team, briefed on this history, expected the same choreography to repeat. One person briefed on the internal discussions described the attitude inside the office of the United States Trade Representative as confident, almost dismissive. Canada was a manageable problem. Carney was an unknown quantity, but assumed to be political, accommodating, and ultimately practical. That assumption was wrong in every dimension. Mark Carney spent 8 years running the Bank of England through Brexit, the single most complex economic decoupling event in post-war European history. He watched British politicians make maximalist demands, and then watched markets reduce those demands to ash within weeks. He understood, at a technical level, that very few politicians in the world possess, exactly how trade disruption moves through supply chains, how currency markets respond to tariff announcements, and how long a large economy can sustain artificial pressure before the pressure reverses direction. When Trump's team announced 25% tariffs on Canadian goods on March 4, 2025, they were expecting a negotiating partner. They got a central banker who had spent a career studying what happens when powerful countries make economically irrational decisions, and who, according to 2 people briefed on his first week in office, spent his transition period building what one described as a response architecture, not a retaliation plan, but a structural repositioning of Canada's trade relationships, designed to make American pressure simultaneously more expensive for Americans and less consequential for Canadians. This is the part of the story that has not been properly reported, and we need to slow down here because the details matter enormously. On March 7, 2025, one day after Carney was briefed on the full tariff scope, the Canadian government made 3 simultaneous moves that, individually, might have looked like routine diplomatic activity. Together, they represented a coordinated strategic pivot of extraordinary sophistication. First, Canada's Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, convened an emergency call with the European Union Trade Commissioner. According to a readout of that call reviewed by sources familiar with its contents, the discussion centered not on tariffs but on supply chain redundancy. specific whether Canada and the EU could construct alternative routing for semiconductor components, agricultural machinery parts, and automotive sub-assemblies that currently flow through American intermediaries. Second, the Canadian Trade Ministry activated what insiders have called the Pacific Pathway, a pre-negotiated framework with Japan, South Korea, and Australia designed to accelerate trade volumes in steel, aluminum, and critical minerals outside the American market. Third, and most significantly, the Bank of Canada issued internal guidance, not a public announcement, but a technical brief to major Canadian financial institutions outlining the condition under which Canada might restructure the currency settlement arrangements that currently make cross-border American trade frictionless. That third move, according to a person with direct knowledge of its contents, was described inside the bank as the nuclear option in slow motion. It hasn't been used, but it was made visible, deliberately, precisely, to the people who would carry its implications directly to Washington. If you are following this story and you want to make sure you don't miss what happens next, subscribe right now. We are going to cover every development in real time, and based on what our sources are telling us tonight, the next 48 hours are critical. Hit that subscribe button. It takes 3 seconds, and it means you are never left behind when a story like this breaks. Now here is where the story enters the dimension that directly affects every American watching this. The 25% tariff on Canadian goods was announced as a tool of economic leverage, a way to force Canada to renegotiate border security provisions, supply chain commitments, and ultimately the terms of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. What the Trump trade team did not fully account for, according to 3 economists briefed on the internal modeling, was the degree to which American industry, specifically American automotive manufacturing, American construction, and American food processing, had become structurally dependent on Canadian inputs in ways that cannot be rapidly substituted. Canadian steel and aluminum don't just go into Canadian products. They go into American cars assembled in Michigan, Ohio, and Tennessee. They go into American pipelines, American bridges, and American military procurement. The 25% tariff did not make those inputs more American. It made them more expensive, and that price increase moved through the American supply chain within weeks, with a directness and speed that economists describe as pass-through, meaning the cost passed directly through manufacturers to consumers with almost no absorption at the corporate level, because margins in manufacturing and construction are already thin enough that there was nowhere for the cost to go except onto the price tag. By March 20th, 2025, 16 days after the tariff announcement, the American Automotive Policy Council had delivered a private brief to the White House, the contents of which were described to this channel by a person familiar with its preparation, warning that the tariff structure was adding between $800 and $1,200 to the per-unit manufacturing cost of vehicles assembled in American plants using Canadian steel. That is not the cost of a Canadian car. That is the cost of an American car, assembled by American workers in American factories, because the steel inside it became $1,200 more expensive overnight. And that cost, the brief noted, would reach American consumers by the third quarter of 2025 at the latest, which it did, quietly, in the form of sticker price increases averaging $940 per vehicle across major American automotive brands. Now here is what is critical to understand, and this is the point that nobody in Washington is being honest about. Carney did not cause that price increase. The tariff caused it, but Carney understood, with the precision of a man who has read 10,000 economic impact assessments, that the price increase would happen, that it would be felt by American consumers before it was felt by Canadian exporters, and that every week the tariff remained in place without a negotiated resolution was another week in which the political cost to the American administration grew, while Canada quietly completed its strategic repositioning away from American dependency. He did not need to win a confrontation with Trump. He needed to make the confrontation expensive enough and long enough that the economic pressure reversed direction. And according to 2 people briefed on the Canadian government's internal tracking of American market data, by late March 2025, Carney's team was watching American consumer confidence numbers, American manufacturing PMI readings, and American congressional Republican polling with the same attentiveness that the White House was watching Canadian export volumes. Like this video right now, if you believe that the American people deserve to know the full story of what their trade policy is actually doing to their wallets, because the mainstream coverage of this story has been almost entirely about the political theater and almost nothing about the economic reality landing on ordinary Americans every single day. The congressional dimension of this story is where it gets particularly significant for anyone watching from the Midwest or the South regions that voted heavily for Trump and that are now experiencing the concentrated economic effects of a trade war that was designed to help them. By April 2025, Republican senators from Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Wisconsin were receiving constituent mail at volumes that, according to 3 Senate staffers briefed on the situation, had not been seen since the 2008 financial crisis. The mail was not about ideology. It was about prices. It was about the cost of a pickup truck. It was about a construction contractor in Columbus whose lumber prices had risen 31% in 6 weeks because Canadian softwood lumber, which supplies approximately 30% American construction-grade lumber, was now subject to a tariff structure that made every house, every commercial building, and every infrastructure project in America more expensive to complete. One Senate staffer, speaking on back, described a meeting in early April, where a senior Republican senator told colleagues that he had done 3 town halls in his state in 10 days, and that at every single one, the first question from the audience was about prices, not about Canada, not about trade policy, but about why everything cost more and when it was going to stop. That political pressure is the mechanism Carney was waiting for. According to a person briefed on the Canadian government's diplomatic strategy, Ottawa was not pursuing a public confrontation with Washington. It was pursuing a patient, structural squeeze, making the tariff war hurt American consumers faster than it hurt Canadian exporters, while simultaneously reducing Canada's long-term dependency on American markets so that the eventual resolution would be negotiated from a position of structural strength rather than desperation. The Pacific Pathway Trade Framework, activated in March, had by April begun generating measurable volume increases in Canadian mineral exports to Japan and South Korea. The EU supply chain redundancy conversations had produced a preliminary framework agreement, not a treaty, but a documented intention that Canadian officials were using in every subsequent conversation with American trade representatives as evidence that the alternative to a negotiated resolution was not Canadian capitulation, but Canadian diversification. The person who understood this dynamic most clearly, according to 2 people familiar with the internal deliberations, was not anyone in the Trump White House. It was Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who by late April was reportedly telling colleagues in private that the Canada situation had developed in a direction that was not consistent with the original modelling and that a resolution needed to be found before the second quarter consumer price data became public. The phrase "not consistent with the original modelling" is Treasury Department language for "we were wrong about how this would work, and the consequences are arriving faster than we predicted." Make sure you share this video with someone you know who is feeling the economic effects of this trade war right now, because understanding what is actually happening is the first step demanding accountability from the people responsible. And subscribe if you haven't already, because the second quarter data that Bessent was worried about has now been released, and we are going to cover exactly what it shows in our next video. Here is what the scenario modeling tells us about where this goes from here, and we want to be precise about the probabilities, because the range of outcomes is genuinely wide. There are 4 scenarios now on the table, and each of them has materially different consequences for American consumers, American retirees, and the broader economic trajectory of 2025. Scenario 1, which carries approximately a 35% probability, is a negotiated partial rollback. In this scenario, the Trump administration finds a face-saving formulation, likely involving Canadian commitments on border security or supply chain transparency, that allows tariffs to be reduced or phased out while being characterized publicly as a win. Carney accepts the formulation because it achieves his structural goal, demonstrating to Canadian voters and Canadian markets that the confrontation produced a durable result. American consumers see some price relief by the fourth quarter of 2025, but the damage already done to the automotive and construction sectors is not reversed, and Canada's strategic diversification into Pacific and European markets continues regardless, meaning America's long-term share of Canadian trade has permanently contracted, even if the immediate tariff crisis resolves. Scenario 2, probability approximately 25%, is escalation. The Trump administration, unwilling to accept any formulation that reads as a concession, increases tariff scope or introduces new trade restrictions. Canada responds by activating additional elements of its response architecture, potentially including the currency settlement mechanisms that the Bank of Canada briefed to financial institutions in March. In this scenario, American consumers face a second wave of price increases in the fourth quarter of 2025 that compounds the first waves, and the political consequences for Republican incumbents in manufacturing states in the 2026 midterms become severe enough to reshape the internal White House calculation on trade policy. Scenario 3, probability approximately 30%, is managed stalemate, the most likely outcome and in many ways the most damaging for American interests. Precisely because it produces no clean resolution, tariffs remain at current levels, Canada continues its diversification, American prices remain elevated. The issue becomes a permanent background condition of economic life rather than a crisis that produces accountability and resolution. This is the scenario that benefits no ordinary American consumer, farmer, retiree, or worker, but that political operatives on both sides can manage as a narrative without having to admit that anyone made a serious mistake. Scenario 4, probability approximately 10%, is the scenario that economists are least willing to discuss publicly, but that multiple people briefed on the modeling describe as not impossible. A formal USMCA renegotiation triggered by Canadian or Mexican legal action under the agreement's dispute resolution mechanisms. If Canada files a formal Chapter 31 dispute, which its trade ministry has been legally preparing for, according to a person familiar with the documents, the timeline for resolution extends to 2026 or beyond. The economic costs become legally documented rather than politically contestable, and the outcome is determined by a process that the Trump administration cannot control through executive action. This scenario is slow, procedurally complex, and politically uncomfortable for everyone involved, which is precisely why it has remained a background option rather than a deployed weapon. But it is real, and it is ready. Here is what to watch for in the next 2 weeks. The second quarter consumer price data becomes fully public by mid-month, and the automotive sector numbers embedded in that data will tell the real story of what the tariff has cost ordinary Americans. Watch for Republican senators from Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, specifically whether they make public statements calling for tariff review. That is the signal that the internal political calculation has shifted. Watch also for any Canadian Trade Ministry announcement regarding Pacific export volumes, because if Canada announces a significant new agreement with Japan or South Korea during this period, it is a deliberate signal to Washington that the window for a favorable negotiated resolution is closing. And watch the currency markets, because the Bank of Canada's settlement guidance, while not yet activated, remains a real option, and the moment it moves from background to foreground, the economic consequences accelerate faster than any political process can respond. The question we leave you with tonight is this. If the most sophisticated trade war America has started in a generation is producing higher prices for American consumers, higher costs for American manufacturers, and a strategic repositioning of our largest trading partner away from dependence on American markets, and if the political class in Washington cannot yet say clearly who is accountable for that outcome, then what does accountability actually look like in a system where the economic consequences land on ordinary people and the political consequences are managed into abstraction? Leave your answer in the comments below, because this audience understands the stakes better than most, and your perspective matters to how we cover this story going forward. Subscribe if you have not already, because what we have described tonight is the first chapter of a story that does not have an ending yet. The next development is coming. We will be here when it does. And if you believe that this kind of coverage, detailed, documented, and unafraid to follow the numbers wherever they lead, is the kind of accountability journalism that America needs right now, hit the like button on your way out. It takes 1 second, and it tells the algorithm that this story deserves to be seen.